The Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as they are known in some parts of the world, were, as we know, the hottest property in the late 80s and early 90s. With any popular children's franchise, this would of course mean video games, and in the Turtles' case, a glut of quality titles developed by Konami. We have already looked at the original arcade game, Turtles in Time, the Hyperstone Heist, and even the Turtles Tournament Fighters fighting games, all of which were decent games in their own rights. Today we are going to be looking at another game from this era and an arcade style beat 'em up produced in the series that will be exclusive to the living room. Let's take a deep dive look at this game, its history, and what else makes it stand out from the pack in the Turtles gaming universe. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 The Manhattan Project, the chronologically confused title that was developed specifically for the home market. Yeah! Speaking of Turtles games chronology, the Famicom in Japan would receive a game simply titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back in May of 1989. As discussed on this channel before, this strange action game that mixed side-scrolling platforming along with navigating a map from an overhead view offered a bizarre start to the series, which was described by Electronic Gaming Monthly as a disappointment. Thankfully for Turtles fans, this game would not be the only Turtles game that saw release that year, as Konami would develop and release another game that was also titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which we often simply refer to today as the arcade game, which would make a lot of sense considering it was an arcade exclusive at the time. This game, on the other hand, delivered everything consumers could have possibly wanted: luscious graphics, 4-player side-scrolling beat-em-up action, and quality music that sounded like it could have come straight from a TV show. The fantastic gameplay experience these cabinets delivered wowed gamers everywhere, which meant it would only be a matter of time until Konami would bring this one home. Fortunately, this wait would not be too long at all, as this title would be ported over to the NES under the name of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Due to the NES's extremely limited hardware, the game would be massively graphically scaled back, both in terms of visuals and the amount of enemy sprites that could appear on screen at once. Sadly, the 4-player co-op feature would be dropped from the game too, but Konami would try their best to make up for these shortfalls by including some brand new stages to flesh the game out more. Despite the game's flaws though, consumers were very happy at this title, as it delivered the best experience it possibly could on such weak, rudimentary hardware. It's sad really that most of the global market had not got round to adopting the Mega Drive by this point in time yet, as that system would have been capable of delivering a much better experience than the NES could have with this game. But sadly, in 1990, most were still happy playing on old 8-bit TAT. Bloody tight bastards. March 1991 would bring the next huge Turtles game to the table, in the form of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Turtles in Time. This title built on everything that was presented in the previous Turtles arcade game, offering flashier graphics, bigger bolder sprites, and even more tantalising music and gameplay. The third Turtles game, Turtles in Time, is arguably the greatest Turtles game ever made, so fans were once again salivating at the prospect of getting this one home. Rather than scale this one back so that this arcade experience could be recreated in 8-bit for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Konami would wisely decide that doing so would simply be too ambitious, and they would not be able to deliver an experience even close to the arcade on the hardware. Instead, Konami would develop a port of this game for the Super Nintendo, 16-bit hardware that could replicate the arcade experience more faithfully. But the home port of this arcade classic would not be ready until 1992, which would leave a 2-year gap between the porting of this title and the other Turtles arcade game on the NES. So to fill the gap and give NES owners something to play in the meantime, a 4th Turtles game would see release in December of 1991, known as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 The Manhattan Project, with Turtles in Time's name later being changed to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 Turtles in Time, with the justification being that it was the 4th Turtles game to see a release on Nintendo living room hardware, as the series gets even more chronologically confusing if we bring the Game Boy games into the mix too. So to make things clear, the Manhattan Project was the 3rd Turtles game to arrive on the NES. But various other Turtles games existed in the arcades, on handhelds, and even home computers. The whole thing is a mess unless you somehow manage to stay inside a Nintendo Entertainment System bubble. One final note to make matters even more confusing, the bloody Famicom version of this game is known as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the Manhattan Project. So, yes, chronologically confusing as I said. So let's now see how this Turtles NES exclusive holds up today and whether or not it delivered a worthy experience. Now the best way to explain how this game functions is that it basically looks and feels and plays like a direct extension of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 for the system, in that it offers the same style graphics and controls, but gives players an entire new story to experience and levels to play through. There are some minor changes to the gameplay though. For example, Turtles can now perform a toss attack when players hold the D-pad downwards and press B. Like in the classic Turtles arcade game, players can perform a different special attack each, giving Rembrandt and his companions a little bit of diversity. Like its NES predecessor, 2-player co-op makes a return, automatically making this game a better purchase than Final Fight for the Super Nintendo. Interestingly, 2-player mode is customizable, giving players the option to be able to damage the other, whilst also the ability to disable this feature, which personally I would recommend, as I see no advantage of being able to hurt your own partner. Bloody weird really. Like in other Turtles games, this one opens up by showing a few slides to establish the game's story. In the Manhattan Project case, the game begins with the Turtles spending their vacation in Key West, Florida. While watching April O'Neil's latest news report, her broadcast is suddenly hijacked by the Turtles' nemesis, Shredder. Taking April as his hostage, Shredder reveals that he has also turned the entire borough of Manhattan into a floating island and challenges the Turtles to come to his lair to stop him. So from here the Turtles set out on an adventure, brawling their way through 8 varied stages. So from here, let's look at what can be experienced during one of these playthroughs. The first stage takes place on a Florida beach, with foot soldiers aplenty to take out. Just like in all previous Turtles beat-em-ups, although sadly, like with all games that were manufactured by this gimped piece of hardware, sprite flicker is pretty terrible in this game. But we can't really expect anything else when it comes to games made to run on such a system. In the later part of the stage, players seem to reach a pier with multiple signs indicating that the Turtles are in Key West. There is even a downward scrolling section in this stage, which is pretty impressive to see in the NES game. A simple boss fight takes place against Rocksteady at the end of the stage, who wields a harpoon weapon in this entry of the series. The following stage sees the Turtles ride waves to Manhattan, in a stage that features some great graphics for the basic 8-bit system. Although I must say I do find it amusing seeing foot soldiers jump out onto water like Free Bloody Willy, which I am going to assume must happen due to the fact that it would have taken up more space having a different enemy jump out of the water. A foot soldier can fire lasers from an aerial vehicle must also be defeated to bring players to the second half of this stage, that takes place aboard a mechanical platform. Here players must avoid and destroy mechanical turrets that pop up out of the ground along with the usual foot soldiers. As players progress, enemies start appearing from doorways and more variants of foot soldiers wielding different weapons begin to show up too. The boss fight takes place against Ground Chuck, who has a tackle attack just like Rocksteady, but can swing his large weapon as well. The next stage takes place on a red bridge, another stage trope which I often comment on as it usually appears in a lot of beat-em-ups. Like other titles, there are holes here to avoid and more enemy sprites start showing up from previous Turtles games, including the large demolition balls, if they can be classed as enemies too. Bebop also tries to run you down in his vehicle in the opening section of this stage. A mid-boss fight on this level takes place against Slash, making his 8-bit debut here. After this, players must continue along the bridge, taking out foot soldier after foot soldier, before finally taking on Bebop, who can perform a kick and a projectile attack. Stage 4 sees players arrive on the floating Manhattan Island, where combat commences in a very Final Fight / Streets of Rage like setting. Literal fighting on the streets. There are even more downward scrolling sections found here too. There are some nice graphical effects to be seen, such as foot soldiers jumping through windows, smashing them in the process. Players then fight enemies through a park section, then back into another street, before descending into an underground. This area even sees a train pull up, which is once again reminiscent of Final Fight. Pretty impressive for the NES. The boss fight in this area takes place against Dirtbag, which I must say is a great name for a villain. In stage 5, players enter a sewer area, as what would be a Turtles game without entering the sewers after all. In this very Turtle stage, the area impressively scrolls in all sorts of directions, as you take on foot soldiers and other enemies that jump and attack from every opening imaginable. This is perhaps the most interesting stage the game has offered yet, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one, considering you would just expect a standard side-scrolling sewer. A mid-boss fight takes place against a foot soldier riding a mechanical steed, until players make it to Leatherhead, a character who had previously appeared as a boss in Turtles in Time. But he does have a different attack pattern here, performing mostly tail whips. Stage 6 sees players arriving in the iconic Technodrome, a vehicle that often serves as an end area for many Turtles games. Once inside this Death Star ripoff, players must take on robots, foot soldiers and other enemies as the difficulty continues to ramp up. There are lasers and conveyor belts and all sorts that must be contended with. Later in the stage, players must fight Razor, a scratchy opponent who also has the ability to freeze the Turtles on the spot. Directly after this, players take on Shredder, the Turtles' arch nemesis. April can also be seen throughout this fight, tied up at the top of the screen. Considering he is a main villain, he does not prove too challenging. Upon his defeat and April's rescue, sadly he escapes to Krang's spaceship above Manhattan. This brings us to stage 7, which starts up by offering a classic beat-em-up lift section, because as I comment every single week, it must have been illegal to program a beat-em-up without including a stage exactly like this. I have to say though, I do love the sunset over Manhattan in this one. Getting through the section brings the Turtles atop a skyscraper, with some enemies arriving via helicopter-like vehicles. Up here, players must take on Toka in a boss battle before finally progressing to the final stage. Aboard Krang's spaceship, everything is thrown at the player in these literal final throws of the game. Once again, as expected, this stage is very Technodrome-like in appearance, with more enemies and obstacles showing up as the players move forward. This is by far both the longest and most challenging stage in the game. Eventually though, players end up in a confrontation with Krang, who has the ability to fight the Turtles by having his robot legs detached from his robotic body. Once he is defeated, Krang escapes, leaving players with one final challenge. Players are confronted with Shredder, who manages to transform into Kevin Nash. Unlike in real life, Kevin Nash has an attack pattern which is more varied than any foe, but after fighting him for, say, a couple of minutes, his quads give out, bringing an end to this game. Congratulations. So, in regards to this whole game, apart from a lot of flicker and all the usual conventions that weaken NES titles, for the hardware, this is a pretty impressive game, delivering an experience that, in my opinion, tops Turtles 2 for the system in pretty much every category. I am impressed with the amount of work it appears that Konami put into this game, with various technical feats being included that show off that the game is far more than just a ROM hack of Turtles 2. In fact, looking at this game, it is a bit sad really that a 16-bit looking version of the title was not released for other hardware, as this game could have been obviously even better if a version was made for a more powerful system. But when you consider the limitations, the Manhattan Project is great. I might even go as far as claiming that this might just be the greatest beat-em-up that NES has to offer. It is very, very impressive. So, all in all, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 The Manhattan Project is a welcome entry within the library of Turtles games from the classic era, and stands out from the pack as relevant by being possibly the best console exclusive game that was not simply a port of a previous arcade game. so the game possibly needs a bit more recognition for that alone. I hope you enjoyed today's video covering the history of this game. If you want to watch more content like this, why not check out some of my other videos covering other entries in the classic Turtles series. There are plenty of videos on my channel for you to go back and watch. If you're new here, make sure you like this video, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, you know, all the usual spiel. But it's also worth mentioning that these videos are only possible at the moment due to the fantastic people who support my work over on Patreon. Advertising revenue has close to dried up since the global economy has shifted in the last few months. But thanks to my backers, I can continue to use my working time to create these videos for you. So huge thank yous and shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, A Murder of Crows, Ego Alethea Swanson, AsiaLight85, Sobby Kwang DX, Aswell Rorikai, Brian Barry, Camberango82, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, ECU Professor, Evan Border, Gary Pinkett, Glennie Glenn, House of Ted, Dropkin Varela, Jordan Durant, Keith Ferguson, Matthew Robinson, Mike Cullix, Nick Daniels, Philip Map, Prince Knight, Princess Zana, Rowan Dinch, Sponge Mac B, Timothy W. Haskins II, TOG Driver, Synth Spaces, Adam Castin, Adrian Hannington, Anders Reinsberg, Andrew Bazansky, Andrew Pearson, Angry Little SOP, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard NG, Bubba Kitty, Salagny, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Crazy Yo, Dan Barlow Jr., Dan Van Dan, David Ball, Gregorius Moradia, Hans Christian, Instant Gratification Monkey, Ivan M, James Bishop, James McDonald, JB, Jazzy Tajol, John Bates, Casey Wright, Langston Miller, Lewis Viant, Luke Canava, Marco Soto, Marvin Araliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Me Machine Dean, Michael Hall, Mike Bruno, New, Paul Elliott, Posty XL, Punky Dudester, Retroverse.com, Richard Stu Stewart, Rick 67, Ron Stud, Sarah Power, Sarai, H. Al Sarai, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord, Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Flaming, Renee, Wazza Jugs, Zai. Thank you so much for all of your support. I love you very much. Yeah.